It started with something small, something that at first didn't seem like much. A quiet evening. A usual Wednesday. I was coming home late from a mission, had been gone for about a week. The house was quiet, like it always is when I come back. No loud "I missed yous" or big hugs. Emily's not that kind of woman. She's reserved. But that night, something was off. She was distant. It was like I could feel the air shift when I walked in, even though she didn't say anything. "Hey babe," I said, setting down my duffel bag and pulling off my boots. "Hey," she answered, but she didn't turn around. She was standing at the counter, her back to me, stirring something in a pot. I couldn't see her face, but I caught the way her shoulders tensed when I spoke. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired or stressed. But then there was that little thing. I went to grab a beer out of the fridge, and as I reached in, I saw a small lipstick mark on the rim of one of the glasses. Not my color. I froze for a second, just staring at it. The mark wasn't big, but it was enough to make me pause. "Did you have someone over?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, like it didn't bother me. But it did. Emily glanced up at me, and for the briefest moment, her eyes went wide, like I caught her off guard. But she quickly masked it. "Oh, I had Amy over earlier. She stopped by to talk about work stuff. You know how it is. We didn't drink much, just tea." I let the lie hang in the air. It wasn't like I didn't believe Amy could have been here. But there was a tension in her voice that made me doubt everything. I could tell she was lying. It was like her whole tone shifted the moment she mentioned Amy. I tried to push it aside. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But later that night, when we were lying in bed, something still felt off. Her back was turned to me, her body stiff, like she was trying to avoid touching me. I could hear her breathing, soft and even, but I knew she wasn't sleeping. I wanted to ask, wanted to confront her right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I closed my eyes and focused on her breathing. And I started thinking. I've worked in intelligence for years. I've learned to read people, to notice the tiny details that others miss. And right then, in the silence of our bedroom, I could feel the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what it was. Tomorrow, I'd start looking. I didn't know how, but I'd figure it out. That's what I do. I find things out. And once I had the answers, that's when everything would change. The next day, I didn't mention the lipstick mark or the odd vibe I felt. I kept things normal. But inside, I knew something was off. I wasn't about to jump to conclusions without proof, but I was going to find out what was going on. I needed to watch, not snoop. Emily was too smart for that. But I had my ways. I used my skills to install a discreet tracking app on her phone. It ran quietly in the background, just enough to see where she was and what she was doing without her noticing. The first few days showed nothing. She stuck to her usual routine: work, gym, meeting friends. But then, on Wednesday, she came home late. About 45 minutes later than usual. I didn't say anything. Traffic happens, right? But something felt off. Emily was always punctual. I made a note of it, but I kept quiet. The next day, I checked the app. Her location pinged in an unfamiliar part of town, near Jake's area. I didn't know much about him, just that he was one of her work buddies. But I'd noticed how he looked at her. Too much eye contact, too many touches. Something about him set off alarms in my head. I didn't say anything that night. I wasn't going to rush into anything. But when Emily came home the next evening with a boutique shopping bag, I knew something didn't add up. I hadn't seen her go shopping, and the bag was from a place I didn't recognize. She didn't even look at me, just walked past and left her phone on the counter. I grabbed it quickly. The tracker showed another unfamiliar location, even closer to Jake's side of town. My heart skipped. Now, I had a real lead. In the following days, Emily's behavior became more erratic. She'd leave work early or stay late, but her excuses didn't add up. When I asked, she was defensive, vague. She was lying, and she knew I could tell. But it wasn't just the lies, it was the way she acted when I didn't react. I didn't accuse her. I didn't show suspicion. I played it cool. But when I made small comments about her being late or things not adding up, she'd laugh nervously or get defensive. She didn't ask about my day. She barely seemed to care about me at all. That hurt more than anything. It was clear now. Emily was hiding something, and I wasn't sure what, but I needed proof. So, I decided to ramp up my strategy. I knew how to manipulate environments, to plant little seeds of doubt. I started making small changes around the house. Nothing big, just subtle shifts. A picture frame moved an inch, a chair tilted slightly. Stuff she wouldn't notice at first, but enough to get her on edge. It didn't take long before I saw the change in her behavior. Her eyes darted around the room, checking things like she was trying to remember where things used to be. She became distracted, twitchy, paranoid. Exactly what I wanted. The real breakthrough came when I pushed a little further. I started telling small lies. Nothing important, just harmless fabrications. And each time I did, her face twitched. She couldn't hide it. I could see it in her eyes. She was slipping. I wasn't confronting her yet. I wasn't stupid. I was playing the long game. Each small lie, each subtle shift in her behavior, told me more. I was getting closer, and the more she tried to cover up, the more mistakes she made. I didn't need to rush. Every change, every small piece of evidence, was getting me closer to the truth. And when I had it all, when I finally knew for sure, that's when I'd bring it all crashing down. By the end of the week, I had enough to be sure. Emily's lies were starting to pile up, each one a little more obvious than the last. I kept quiet about it, waiting, watching. The more I stayed silent, the more she started to slip up. I kept making small changes around the house. Just little things. A picture frame moved an inch. A chair turned the wrong way. I wanted her to feel the discomfort of something being out of place, without knowing why. One night, she came home late again, same time as the past few nights. She didn't say anything to me. Didn't even look at me. She just walked past like it was nothing. I stayed still, pretending not to notice. When she entered the kitchen, I followed her. I leaned against the counter, casual as ever, and asked her, "You've been working a lot lately, huh?" She paused for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled, too wide. "Yeah, busy time at work. You know how it is." I wasn't fooled. The tone in her voice wasn't right. It was like she was too rehearsed, trying too hard to make everything seem normal. But I didn't react. I just nodded, pretending I didn't know better. The next morning, I decided to push her a little. I brought up something small, something I knew would catch her off guard. "You were in that area by the park yesterday, weren't you?" She froze. Her face went pale, and her eyes darted to the door, like she was trying to figure out how much time she had before she had to lie her way out of it. "No," she said quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. I wasn't there." I stayed calm. That's weird, because I thought I saw you there." I didn't say anything more. I just let the silence hang between us. She fumbled with her words, her smile wavering. I don't know what you mean." I didn't need her to admit anything. I already knew. Her phone had pinged right in that area, the same spot where Jake lived. I let her retreat to the bedroom, trying to act like nothing was wrong. But I saw the way she glanced back at me, that nervous look, as if wondering whether I'd finally catch on. She didn't know how much I already knew. Over the next few days, I noticed her being extra careful with her phone. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter, but she'd keep checking it like she was waiting for a message. Like she was hoping I wouldn't see something. Each time she did that, I saw it, her anxiety creeping in. She knew I was close, and she was scared. But I didn't let on. I just watched her unravel without giving her a chance to explain. I wasn't confronting her. Not yet. I was playing the long game. The more I stayed silent, the more she got paranoid. Every little lie, every shift in her behavior, brought her closer to the truth coming out. I didn't need to rush. The cracks were already there, and soon enough, they'd widen enough for her to fall through. It didn't take long for Emily to start getting reckless. The more I stayed silent, the more she tried to cover her tracks, clutching her phone, avoiding eye contact, getting defensive whenever I asked simple questions. I didn't need to rush into anything. I was letting her dig her own hole. The night it all started to crack open happened after a work dinner she had to go to. She came home later than usual, her eyes a little too wide, her movements too quick. Normally, she'd relax, take off her heels, toss her bag on the couch. This time, she was jittery, like she had to get somewhere fast. "Long night?" I asked casually, watching her toss her things aside and start pacing the living room. "Yeah," she muttered. "A lot of stuff to go over." I stayed still, keeping my voice level. "You had fun?" She hesitated, then forced a laugh. "Yeah, sure. You know how it is. Just a lot of talking." Something about her tone didn't sit right with me. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. She wasn't making eye contact, and every time I asked a simple question, she'd either give me short answers or change the subject. That was when I decided to push. "Jake was there, wasn't he?" I asked like it was the most innocent thing in the world. Her face went pale. It was so quick, but I caught it, those wide, panicked eyes. She blinked a couple of times and then stammered, "What? No. Why would he be there?" I kept my eyes on her, not reacting. I didn't need to. I knew the answer. Jake had been there. And it wasn't just business anymore. "I don't know," I said, leaning back in my chair. "He was just always around you at the office. I thought maybe you'd grab dinner after. I was just curious." Her voice got a little higher, defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not in charge of who's at the dinner. You know how these things go." I didn't reply. I just let the silence hang. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. She knew she was caught, and I could see it in the way she shifted her weight, avoiding my gaze. Then, without saying another word, I stood up and walked into the kitchen. I wasn't going to let her control the pace. It was my turn now. From the kitchen, I could see her standing in the living room, her fingers twitching, like she didn't know what to do. For a moment, I thought she might try to leave the house, but she didn't. She just stood there, caught in the trap I'd set. I didn't need to press any further. I wasn't about to get into a screaming match with her. I was already ahead of her, and I didn't need to rush the endgame. The next morning, she left for work early, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't leave her phone behind. But she did leave the house in a hurry, grabbing her keys and purse, her face pale again. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. I was letting her stew in the mess she'd made. She didn't even know it yet, but she was already losing control of the situation. I could feel it now. The tension between us was so thick, it was almost suffocating. She knew I was onto her, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. Not yet. Not until I had everything. The lies were getting bigger, and I was just waiting for her to fall. The next few days were a slow burn. Emily tried harder to act normal, but I could see the tension. She was always glancing at me, always a step ahead of herself. She was waiting for me to break, but I didn't give her that satisfaction. I stayed quiet, letting her dig her own hole. That weekend, she had a work event, a fundraiser or something corporate. Normally, I'd go with her, but not this time. I wasn't about to give her the chance to hide anything from me. I stayed home, letting her think everything was fine while I put my own plan into motion. I had an old friend in town, someone who owed me a favor. It wasn't just about tracking Emily anymore, it was about leverage. While she was off at her event, I made a quick call, set things in motion, and waited. By midnight, I had the proof. My friend sent me a blurry picture of Emily and Jake, walking out of a restaurant together, laughing. My stomach sank, but I didn't feel anger like I thought I would. I felt numb. It was real now. This wasn't just a late night or a business dinner. She was hiding something, and Jake was at the center of it. I didn't confront her when she came home. She was high from the event, all smiles, as if nothing was wrong. Her phone stayed glued to her hand, and she kept checking it every few minutes. She was nervous, like she was waiting for a message, but didn't want me to know who it was from. I asked casually, "Busy night?" "Oh yeah," she replied. "Fundraising, speeches, The usual. I didn't press her. I could see her shaking hands, the way she kept glancing toward the door, like she was waiting for someone. The lie was written all over her face. But I stayed calm. I didn't need to say anything else. The proof was in her actions. That night, she stayed up late, scrolling through her phone. I heard the soft clicking of her fingers typing but didn't say anything. She was pretending like I wouldn't notice, but the silence between us was deafening. She knew I knew. She went to bed early, but I stayed up, watching. Every time she shifted, her face flickered with guilt. She wasn't asleep. She was waiting for the inevitable. The next morning, Emily rushed out the door, looking like she was trying to escape without being caught. She didn't even look at me when she said goodbye. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but I didn't say anything. She was starting to unravel, and I knew it. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. I had everything I needed. The affair wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Emily was losing control, and I was just waiting for the right moment to bring it all crashing down. The next few days felt strangely quiet. Emily was on edge, but she kept her act up, smiling, pretending like everything was fine. She tried to go about her routine, but the cracks were showing. Every time she thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch her glancing at her phone, almost as if she was afraid of it. I stayed out of her way. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I had more control over this situation than she realized. The silence between us was thick now, and it was starting to eat at her. I could see the nervous energy in her every movement. She was fidgeting more, checking the time constantly, always acting like she was on the verge of being caught. I let it continue. The more she tried to cover up her actions, the more she exposed herself. One night, she came home from work later than usual. Her eyes were wide, her shoulders tense like she was carrying some weight. She didn't even try to make conversation this time. She just walked in, threw her purse on the couch, and went straight to the bedroom. It wasn't the usual casual "Hey, babe," or "How was your day?" No, this time, she didn't want to deal with anything. I stayed quiet, watching her retreat into the bedroom. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I already knew what was going on. I could feel it in the air. The guilt was suffocating her. Later that evening, I decided to do something subtle. I had gotten a copy of her work schedule through some back channels. Nothing big, just a list of the events and meetings she was supposed to attend. That night, I checked it against her phone's location history. Sure enough, there was a gap, about 3 hours, where she'd said she'd been at work. But according to her phone, she was nowhere near the office. She'd been somewhere else. I didn't need to investigate further. I knew exactly where she'd been. I could guess exactly what she was doing. The next morning, I acted like nothing was wrong. Emily was still on edge, but I pretended I hadn't noticed anything out of place. I didn't need to push her yet. She was already guilty. It was in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, the way her movements were too fast, too jittery. At breakfast, I casually asked, "How's Jake doing with the project?" "Still running things over at the office." Her face went white, but she quickly recovered. "Yeah, he's fine. Everything's fine. We're just getting things sorted." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, letting the silence stretch out between us. I could feel her trying to mask the panic that was creeping in. She knew I was onto her, but I wasn't giving her a reason to panic just yet. Everything was moving according to plan. Emily was trapped in her own web of lies, and I was just waiting for her to make the wrong move. She was too far in now. There was no going back for her. By now, Emily was starting to unravel in ways I hadn't even expected. She was slipping up more frequently, doing things that were too obvious to ignore, even if she didn't realize it. The little things, like how she wouldn't put her phone down at dinner, or how she'd jump when I asked about her day, like she was waiting for me to catch her. I could see her getting more paranoid, but she didn't know it yet. She still thought she could pull the wool over my eyes. One evening, after work, she came home early, looking flustered, like something was off. She tossed her purse on the counter and hurried to the bathroom without even saying hello. Normally, she'd at least make small talk, but not this time. I watched her go. It was like she was trying to escape me, trying to escape the tension between us. But I wasn't letting her get away that easily. I decided it was time to test her. I'd been watching her behavior for weeks now, so I knew exactly how she'd react to the right kind of push. I waited until she came out of the bathroom, then I casually said, "Jake called me earlier today." Her eyes froze. I saw the instant panic in her face, but she tried to play it cool. "Jake? Why would he call you?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Just wanted to check in. Asked me if I was coming by the office sometime." "Weird, huh?" Her hand tightened around the edge of the doorframe, like she was gripping it for support. She wasn't even pretending anymore. "I don't know why he'd be calling you," she said too quickly. Maybe he needed something." I leaned in a little, pretending to be more interested. "Oh yeah. He didn't mention anything about you two working late together again." Her face went pale. "What? No. What are you talking about?" I gave her a small smile, one that was almost pitying. "You don't have to lie, Em. I know you've been meeting him after work. I've seen the messages. I've seen the calls." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, frozen, her eyes darting to the side. "You're being ridiculous," she finally muttered, but the shake in her voice gave her away. I didn't push her further. Not yet. She was already on the defensive, and I wasn't in a rush to finish her off. I could feel the control slipping away from her. The guilt was eating her up from the inside out. That night, she barely touched her dinner, something she used to love. She was restless, getting up every few minutes, pacing. The silence between us was thick, uncomfortable. It was clear to me now, she wasn't just cheating on me. She was terrified of getting caught, and it was starting to break her down. The lies were piling up, and she didn't have the strength to hold them all together anymore. I knew I was close. So close. I didn't need her to admit anything. The cracks were so wide now, she couldn't hide from them anymore. But there was still something I needed to do. One last thing to make sure her entire world came crashing down. She'd put herself in this position, and now it was time for the truth to finally come to light. It was Thursday when Emily made the mistake I'd been waiting for. She came home later than usual, and as she walked in, I noticed the lipstick mark on her coat collar. Red, the same shade Jake always used. I didn't let on that I'd noticed. I acted casual, just like before. "Everything good?" I asked. She froze at the door, too quick with her reply. "Yeah, just work stuff." She quickly dropped her bag on the couch and hurried to the kitchen. But I wasn't letting this slip by. "You're wearing Jake's lipstick," I said flatly. She stiffened, her face draining of color. "What? No, it's just mine." "You're being ridiculous." I shook my head. "No, it's his. You've been wearing it every time you see him." She faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about. It's nothing, really. Just work." I moved closer, my voice quiet but sharp. "Don't lie to me anymore. You've been meeting him, haven't you? You've been sleeping with him." Her eyes darted around the room, panic creeping into her face. It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I asked, cutting her off. "What's been going on between you two?" Her breath hitched. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just got out of hand." The excuse felt weak, like sand slipping through her fingers. I stepped closer, my tone cold. "You've been lying to me for months. You think I haven't noticed?" She just stood there, shaking, unable to form an excuse. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said quietly, voice breaking. Her words barely registered. I wasn't interested in her apologies anymore. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice she'd made. A choice that ruined everything. I turned and walked to the door without another word. "I'm done, Emily. I'm done with the lies." She called my name, but I didn't look back. There was no fixing this. She was too far gone. I was done trying. I didn't hear from Emily the rest of that night. Not a text. Not a call. She probably didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't want to hear it anyway. I gave her space, but deep down, I knew she was unraveling. She'd been playing this game for too long, and now the truth was too much to handle. The next morning, I woke up early. It wasn't the usual routine anymore. Emily was still in bed, but I could tell she was faking sleep, trying to avoid me, trying to avoid the mess she'd created. I didn't want to look at her anymore. Not after everything. But I knew I had to finish this, to give her a taste of the consequences. I didn't bother with breakfast. I grabbed my stuff, slammed the door behind me, and went to the garage. My mind was already working, moving ahead to the next step. The plan wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Jake needed to be dealt with first. He was the catalyst for this whole mess, the one she'd been lying about. I'd already started digging into his past. With my connections, I had everything I needed. His history, his ties to shady people, all of it. It wouldn't take much to get him out of the picture, permanently. But Emily, she was next. She'd been so sure of herself, so confident she could keep playing the role of the innocent wife. The funny thing was, she had no idea how fast the walls were closing in on her. Her lies had spiraled, and now her friends, her co-workers, everyone, were starting to pull away. Slowly at first, but then it would be faster, like a wave crashing over her. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything, the betrayal, the lies, the broken trust. I wasn't going to let her off easy. Emily had done this to herself. She was the one who thought she could get away with it. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange calm. I'd been furious, sure, but now it was just about the consequences. I'd started something I couldn't stop, and I didn't want to. She needed to feel what she'd put me through. The game was over. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension. Emily didn't know what to do. She couldn't figure out how to fix it, and I wasn't about to give her any hints. She tried to make small talk, like we were back to normal, but it only made things worse. I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified. She knew she'd crossed a line, and now the weight of it was on her shoulders. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. I kept to myself more and more. Work was a good excuse. I wasn't lying about that. I was busy. But it was more than that. I didn't want to be around her anymore, not when everything between us felt so broken. Every time she tried to reach out, I pulled further away. I saw the change in her, the way she started looking at me, like she was waiting for something, anything. I didn't give her that closure. She didn't deserve it. I just kept moving forward, letting the tension simmer. Then, one evening it happened. I came home late, like I had been doing for a while now. Emily was sitting in the living room, her eyes red, her makeup smeared from earlier in the day. She didn't even look at me when I walked in. The silence between us felt heavier than usual. I sat down on the couch, pretending like I didn't notice her. She waited for a moment before speaking. "Michael," her voice broke, soft and strained. "Please, just talk to me." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. The truth was already out, and no amount of talking could change what had happened. But I wasn't done yet. "I'm not angry anymore, Emily," I finally said. "I'm just done. You've ruined this. You've ruined us." Her lip quivered as she wiped at her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was just confused. I didn't." "Stop," I cut her off, my tone colder than I intended. "You don't get to make excuses anymore. This isn't some mistake you can apologize for. You knew exactly what you were doing." She looked away, her face crumpling, but she didn't respond. I could see it in her eyes. This was her breaking point. The guilt was eating her alive, but it was too late for any of it to matter. I didn't care about her excuses anymore. I didn't care about her guilt. Her world was crumbling, piece by piece. And I wasn't going to help her pick up the pieces. A few more days passed, and it felt like I was watching Emily drown in her own guilt. She stopped pretending everything was fine, but I could see her trying to hold on, clinging to whatever piece of normalcy she could. The problem was, I wasn't giving her that. Every interaction was distant. Every conversation, short. She'd try to reach out, but I always pushed her away. I could tell she was getting desperate. She started showing up at my work, trying to catch me alone. At first, I ignored her. I didn't even let her in. But then one afternoon, she caught me in the parking lot as I was leaving. Michael, please, she said, almost breathless. I need to talk to you. I can't just keep pretending like nothing happened. I stopped, looking at her. She had that familiar look of someone who was on the edge, someone who knew they were about to lose everything. And part of me, just a small part, felt a little sorry for her. But I was done. I didn't owe her anything anymore. I don't need to hear your apologies, Emily. It's too late for that. Her face tightened, but she didn't back down. You don't even want to hear my side of it? You don't want to understand why I did it? No, I said, stepping back. I already know why you did it. Because you wanted to. Because it was easier than facing the truth. She flinched like I'd slapped her. It was painful to watch, but I didn't flinch. I was done with her lies. Jake isn't the only one who's going to pay for this, I added. You've got more coming, Emily. A lot more. She stared at me, her eyes wide, like she didn't understand what I meant. But I wasn't about to explain it to her. The consequences were already in motion, and she was too far gone to stop it now. I don't care if you're sorry, I said, turning away. I'm not the one who needs to hear it. She didn't chase after me, didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, watching me walk away. And I knew, in that moment, that she was finally starting to see it. The life she had, the one she thought she could control, was slipping away. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The days dragged on, but beneath the surface, a quiet voltage crackled between us. Emily and I barely spoke, but the tension was always there, thick in the air like static. She tried to act like everything was normal, throwing a half-hearted smile my way when I came home, but I wasn't fooled. Every move she made seemed calculated, as though she was trying to fix things without actually facing the damage. But she couldn't. There was no fixing this. The storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Jake was the next piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just the guy Emily had been sleeping with. He was a liability, tangled up with people who didn't play by the rules, who could make problems disappear if you knew how to get to them. I'd already gathered everything I needed to know about him. The criminal ties, the shady dealings, all of it. All I had to do was pull a few strings, and he'd be gone. So, I made a call to some of my contacts. People who knew how to make things disappear. People who knew how to erase someone without leaving a trace. I didn't need to know the details. I didn't care about the fallout for Jake. He'd made his bed with Emily, and now he was going to lie in it. By the time the sun set the next day, Jake was out of the picture. I didn't tell Emily a thing. She didn't deserve to know. She'd been living in a fog, pretending everything was fine, but she knew nothing about what was happening behind the scenes. The worst part was, she wasn't even asking about him anymore. She could feel the absence, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. As the days passed, the cracks in her world became more visible. Her phone started buzzing with calls she ignored. Texts piled up unanswered. I noticed her friends, the ones who had always been there for her, starting to pull away. It wasn't in any obvious way, no big confrontations, no loud fights, but it was clear. People who'd once had her back were now keeping their distance. One evening, Emily came home looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were dark and tired, her clothes disheveled. She tried to keep it together, pretending like everything was okay, but it wasn't. Her anxiety was written all over her face. She wasn't the confident, carefree woman I used to know. She was unraveling. Michael, please, she said quietly, barely above a whisper. I know I screwed up. I know it's too late for apologies, but I can't lose everything. I didn't respond right away. There was no point in trying to explain things to her. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Everything's falling apart for you, isn't it? I said, my voice steady. The lies, the betrayal, the people who are starting to turn on you. Her face went pale. I saw it then, the realization hit her, like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just losing me. She was losing everything she thought she had. She stood there, frozen in place as I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. You had your chance, Emily, I said without turning back. Now you're going to see what it feels like to lose everything. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked out, but I didn't look back. By the time I returned home the next evening, things had shifted again. Emily was different. Haggard, a little thinner, her movements sharp and unsteady. It wasn't just the lack of sleep anymore, it was the weight of everything catching up to her. She didn't even try to pretend things were normal anymore. Her eyes darted around like she was searching for an escape that didn't exist. She was starting to crack. "I need to know what's happening," she said when I walked through the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you planning? What are you doing, Michael?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I tossed my bag onto the table and headed straight to the fridge. I pulled out a beer and cracked it open, taking my time. I could feel her watching me, her desperation hanging in the air like smoke. "You're not gonna stop this, are you?" she asked, her voice shaking now. This whole thing with Jake with us? Michael, what do you want from me?" I took a long drink, letting the silence stretch between us. "What I want doesn't matter anymore, Emily. It's what you've done that's important." Her eyes were wide, almost frantic, as she took a step toward me. "I made a mistake. It wasn't like you think. I didn't want it to go this far." I shook my head, setting the beer down on the counter. "You didn't want it to go this far? You're lying to yourself. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think it would come to this." She recoiled slightly, like I'd slapped her. The guilt was eating her alive, but she still wouldn't admit it. "Why? Why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you come to me first?" she asked, her voice breaking. I didn't have the patience for her tears anymore. "Because you didn't care, Emily. You made your choice, and now you're dealing with the consequences." Her face twisted with frustration. "I don't know what you want me to say. What do you want me to do to fix this?" I leaned against the counter, my eyes meeting hers. "There's nothing left to fix. The damage is done." The silence that followed was heavy. I could see her trying to process everything, trying to figure out what move to make next. But it was too late for that. She'd already made her choices, and now she had to live with them. "I'm not gonna make this easy on you," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Jake's gone, and your friends, well, they're starting to figure things out too. You've burned every bridge, Emily." Her breath hitched. I could tell she wasn't ready to face that truth. "I didn't want it to end like this," she whispered, the guilt weighing her down. "It's too late for that," I said, cutting her off. "You should have thought about that before you started this whole mess." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, stunned and silent. She wasn't going to fix anything. She couldn't. Her world was already falling apart. The following days were quieter, almost painfully so. Emily had stopped trying to talk to me, at least in any meaningful way. She'd ask about my day, maybe offer some trivial comment about dinner, but the usual rhythm between us was gone. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed, and I wasn't about to play along. I noticed more than a few things happening around the house. Her phone was always buzzing, always ringing, but she never picked it up. Her friends still hadn't called back, the few that were left in her circle. Every time I passed her, I could feel the tension, like she was always a second away from breaking. I wasn't the only one who'd been cutting ties with her. One morning, I came back early from the gym. Emily was in the kitchen, standing in front of the counter with her phone in her hand. I watched her for a moment, just standing there, the phone pressed to her ear. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She was listening to someone on the other end, but she wasn't responding. The longer I stood there, the more I realized she wasn't listening. She was waiting. Waiting for the other person to say something to make it better. But there was no one left to save her. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my coffee, poured it into a cup, and walked out the door. The moment I was gone, I heard the phone click. It was like she couldn't hold it together anymore. Later that day, I watched her collapse in front of the mirror, her hands pressed to her face as if she could stop the tears from coming. But they came anyway, the silent sobs that shook her entire body. She hadn't even noticed me standing in the doorway. I could have walked in, said something, but what would it matter? She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry that it was falling apart. The thing about people like Emily is that they never see it coming. They think they can control the damage, that they can lie their way out of everything. But once the truth starts coming to light, there's no way to stop the flood. It spills over, and they're left standing there, drowning in it. Later that night, after I'd come back from running errands, I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She looked so small. I almost felt sorry for her, but I shook it off. There was no place for sympathy anymore. "You're not even trying, are you?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the quiet. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me with those empty eyes. I wasn't expecting an apology. At this point, I wasn't even sure if she understood how deep this cut went. "What's the point?" she muttered, her voice flat. "You've already made up your mind." I stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. There was truth in that, but there was also defeat. She was done fighting, and I wasn't going to help her. "No one's coming to fix this for you, Emily," I said, my tone cold. "You're on your own now." She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her face. The realization had hit her like a freight train. The people she thought she could rely on, the life she thought she had, it was all slipping away. And I wasn't about to step in and hold her hand through it. I turned and walked out of the room again, leaving her there, just like I'd been doing for weeks now. By now, I could see Emily was in full panic mode. The cracks in her life were more than visible. They were wide, gaping wounds. And every time she tried to patch things up, it just made the bleeding worse. She wasn't dumb, she knew something was coming. It wasn't just me pulling away anymore. It was everyone. The friends who used to reach out were now silent, her phone was full of ignored calls, and even her work had started questioning her. She couldn't hide it any longer. I had been watching it all unfold from a distance, keeping my own life on track, while she self-destructed. Emily was no longer the confident, self-assured woman I once knew. She was a shell of herself, and it was almost sad to see. Almost. I'd been building something in the background. Slowly, quietly, waiting for the right moment. The pieces were all in place, and now it was time to see how far she'd fall. One afternoon, Emily walked into the living room, her eyes bloodshot and tired. She had a wild, frantic energy about her, like she couldn't sit still for even a second. I didn't need to ask. I already knew she'd been running around, trying to find someone who would give her answers, trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. "Michael, I need to know what you've done," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "You're behind all of this." "I know it." I didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." She shook her head, pacing the room. "Stop it. I'm not stupid. You've been orchestrating this, pushing people away from me, cutting off all my connections. This is your revenge, isn't it? You want to watch me burn." I let her rage, letting her talk herself into a frenzy. Part of me almost wanted to tell her the truth, to show her how far I'd gone, how deep I'd dug. But there was no satisfaction in explaining it. No need for a grand reveal. She already knew she was losing. That was the punishment. "You're right," I finally said, my voice calm, almost detached. "You're getting exactly what you deserve. Every bit of it." She stopped pacing, her face crumpling with a mix of disbelief and something that almost looked like fear. "You can't do this," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Please. I don't deserve this." I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing. There was no anger, no hurt. Just emptiness. She wasn't the woman I married anymore. She was a stranger. And she had made sure of it. "You had everything, Emily," I said, standing up and walking toward the door. "And you threw it all away. Now you get to watch it all disappear." I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I didn't want to hear any more of her pleas or excuses. I knew she was broken, and I didn't need to stick around to watch the final fall. When I stepped out that door, I knew I was done. There was no turning back now. Everything I had planned, everything I had set in motion, was coming to an end. Emily was going to face the consequences of her actions, and there wasn't a thing she could do to stop it. And I didn't care anymore.